Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bryce is Right. I am Bryce Roney, and I believe in promoting positive atheism and secular humanism. And today I'm going to be having a conversation with a Christian of all things. His name is Reverend Brandan Robertson. This is Brandon's second appearance on the Atheist Network group, but his first on the Bryce is Right. So today we will be discussing his Christian faith as well as his ministry. We will briefly talk about how he reconciles that with his LGBTQ identity and activism, because he is also an LGBTQ ally, which will be very interesting. So we'll discuss what he's been up to a year ago as well, because we did talk to him before. But first, I'll reintroduce him to some of you guys. The last time we spoke he was in between congregations, so we'll see where he's landed from there. And we'll also talk about the circumstances under which he left his old congregation and what he's been doing since then. So just a little background. Reverend Robertson is the founder and spiritual leader of Metanoia. I hope I'm saying that correctly, and he'll correct me later if I'm not. Metanoia, which is a global digital faith community. He's also been named by the Human Rights Campaign as one of the top faith leaders leading the fight for LGBTQ plus equality, working with political leaders and activists around the world to end conversion therapy and to promote human rights of sexual and gender minorities. So, mouthful. Reverend Robertson, pastor, teacher, spiritual leader, come on down. You are the next guest on the Bryce is Right. How are you doing?
I'm doing so well. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be back. We had a similar conversation you said almost a year ago, and it was such a generative time, such an interesting conversation. And I'm glad to be back chatting with you. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming back. And since it's been like kind of a year ago, and a lot of people may not have been familiar with that, I am going to have you sort of reintroduce yourself, kind of give us your background, what your beliefs are, how you came to them, and we'll go for there. We won't make the whole show about that. If people don't get it, in this short little segment, they can refer back to that previous video, because we do want to talk about what you've been doing now and kind of whether your stances on anything have changed. So who is Brandan Robertson?
Yeah, well, I'll give you 30 years and 3 minutes. Essentially, I grew up in the Maryland, D.C. area in a non-religious family, and also had kind of a lower class, abusive, alcoholic family situation. And so by the age of 12, I was really, I had an anxiety disorder, severe depression. I was really mentally broken down. And it was at that period of my life that my fundamentalist Baptist neighbors started inviting me to come to church with them. And after going to church for about 4 months, I had a radical conversion experience. And I got saved, so to speak, gave my life to Jesus, and a few months later felt a distinct sense of calling to want to give my life to cultivating the same kind of religious community that helped me have this experience that at a young age made me feel like my life had purpose and value. And so really from 12 years old to today, I've been on that journey of going deeper in some senses into Christian faith, but also going to the very edges of it and being pushed out of it by some people. And yet this distinct calling of being a pastor has remained. And for me, that means not converting people, not trying to convince people to be Christian, not even trying to teach people theology or doctrines, but rather helping people navigate the big questions of life and navigate identity, navigate belonging and inclusion. Because I think at the core of all of my religious experience, it wasn't the doctrine, the dogma, the ceremonies and traditions that gave my life meaning. What saved my life as a 12-year-old was people that actually cared about me and wanted to come alongside me. And though I disagree with so much of what they taught me, and especially now as an openly gay man, how I was treated in so many religious environments was terrible, but I still believe, and I have seen how faith communities from a progressive perspective can come along and help people heal from past religious trauma and move towards more wholeness in their life. And so that's why I've stayed connected to the religious community. And that's why I still identify as a pastor and still work in these spaces. Although most Christians, if you do a little Google search, you'll find most Christians don't call me a Christian anymore, and I'm probably on the very edges of that. But still compelled by Jesus, still wanting to help people learn how to heal and have a whole life. That's really what I'm about in the world.
Okay, well, that's a very admirable mission. I can't really fault that too much. You said that you began this journey when you were about 12 years old. Do you
Yeah,
mind if I ask, how old are you now? Because you
I'm
still look fairly
29.
young.
Yeah. About to be
Pardon?
30. About to be 30 in June. So
Okay, so you're almost grown.
yeah, I know,
Thir-
it's crazy.
30 is the age of grownness in my opinion, because when I was 20 I thought I was grown, and
Yeah,
when I was 29 I realized all of the things that I didn't know.
totally.
And then I became much more confident in the following years. So kudos, you're almost there. So in the well, I guess 18 years, 17 years you've roughly been a Christian. What were your beliefs before that? Some people remember like before they were 12, and if they
Yeah.
had a God belief, then would you say that that would apply to you, or how
Yeah.
did that?
I mean, unfortunately, I grew up in the age of social media. And so there's even here on YouTube, if people do a Google search, I won't tell you what the username is. I was recording videos back when I was like 13 or 14, speaking about my fundamentalist beliefs. So it's still on here. And I was about as far right as you could go. I was fundamentalist, independent, Bible believing Baptist is how our church identified, which meant we believed the King James Version of the Bible was the only authentic, inspired word of God, and that every word of it was scientifically, historically, factually, psychologically true in everything it said. I remember going to school as a teenager. I wore a 6-inch wooden cross around my neck, and I would go and find my Muslim peers and tell them that they were going to hell. And I would find the Mormons, and I would find the Catholics, and I would literally.
I
Uh,
imagine that you didn't have too many friends in school.
what was actually funny is you're right. I got a lot of opposition, and my peers found it humorous. They called me Bible Boy and Ishmael were my two nicknames in high school, and
Mhm.
thankfully everybody else had a good humor about my faith. Although I took it overly seriously, and as a kid who had an anxiety disorder, it wasn't a good thing to feel like the souls of your classmates were your responsibility, but I certainly felt like they were. um,
Now, this is a little bit of a personal question, and you have to feel free to decline to answer if that's your choice.
yeah
I didn't think that this would come up. I didn't tell you that I was going to ask this question, but I am curious because I'm wondering if there's a relation. Are you comfortable saying how old you were when you realized you were gay?
yeah, no, totally. I think it's a perplexing question, right? I don't have so many LGBT people have a moment like in the way I had a faith moment where I became a Christian. I don't have a moment where I realized I was gay, but looking back,
When I would that maybe ask, when did you begin to suspect?
yeah, my first gay moments, I will say, were end of middle school into high school. So right after I became a Christian, I started wrestling with my sexuality, and I knew very clearly and very quickly that the church said that this was a sin. And so, as immediately as I started realizing I was gay, I immediately started repressing because it was a sin.
Okay. And the reason I asked you that was to maybe establish whether or not you had that realization before you were running around telling all these other kids that they were going to hell, or
Yeah,
after. And some people might assert that the reason that you had been doing it before was kind of as a coping mechanism or defense mechanism for your
yeah.
realization about yourself. But if that's not the case, then it could just simply have been a matter of familial indoctrination.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with the fact that, again, coming to faith at 12 as somebody who was mentally broken down and abused young kid, faith for me was a crutch. Religion was a crutch. I'm happy to acknowledge that it it wasn't the doctrine or theology that saved my 12-year-old mental health. Frankly, it was a community that came around me. My family had rejected me, and when other people had made me feel like I was unlovable, the church community came around me and said, "God loves you. God has a plan for you. And if you stick with us, we love you and accept you as well." And so, yeah, I think in some sense, that's religion at its best, that it can be a supportive community for people. Unfortunately, very quickly, I hit the wall of discrimination and homophobia, and it became quite toxic. But um,
How
yeah,
old were you? how old were you when you came out, though? You said that you had the realization in your late teens, but when
Yeah.
did you actually come out?
Yeah. So I got outed when I was probably 21 or 22.
Okay. This is when your
So
parents found out?
no, so well, yes, they found out at that moment, but it was a long, dramatic story. But essentially, Time Magazine did an article and outed me publicly, and then
That
right
damn Time magazine.
yeah, but it was good. I mean, I'm thankful for it now because as soon as I was out in Time Magazine, my dating life in DC opened up very quickly because everybody knew I was gay, so it was great. But
It sounded like you said that your family had a negative react, which predictably, coming from a conservative fundamentalist background, they should have a negative reaction. I'm wondering how long that lasted. Is that still the case? Have you been able to reconcile at all, or?
yeah, so actually, I didn't grow up in a religious family, and so my family was fine. They're kind of I call them rednecky conservative, right? We were trailer park southern white folks, and they had that kind of mindset that was basically they didn't understand homosexuality, but they had a live and let live mentality. And so when I was out, when my parents heard that I was publicly identifying as gay, they basically said, "We don't understand, but we're here to support you, and we don't like the fact that religious people are saying mean things about you." And so I was actually really lucky in the sense that my family wasn't religious. I came to faith on my own, and so
You were more religious than your family was?
significantly, yeah, and still today am, funny enough. But
Wow.
yeah,
Okay, so let's get a little bit into your interpretation of Christianity, because you do
yeah,
identify as a Christian. You talked about how other Christians kind of have disowned you in
yeah,
terms of they are resorting to the no true Scotsman fallacy when it
yeah,
comes to you and people like you, promoting this homosexuality and this this sinful lifestyle. Where did they all go wrong, and how did you get it right? Maybe that's a way to ask.
what a question, what a question. So I do think this, like a lot of atheists and a lot of non-religious folks that I talk to have a fair critique of a lot of people in the gay Christian movement, which is that we're just trying to make the Bible pro-LGBT when the Bible's anti-LGBT, and therefore we should just reject it as an archaic text.
Can I pause you right there? I'm
Yeah,
gonna let you finish. I want
yeah,
to let you finish that, but just to give some context, I would be one of those people that you were speaking about. Back in
yeah,
my Christian days, that's exactly what I tried to do.
yeah,
Um, for personal reasons, I also am a member of the LGBTQ community, and also for morality reasons, just my own intuitive sense of morality. It didn't jive with what the Bible was saying,
yeah,
but I wanted the Bible to be true. So
yeah,
therefore I had to find the interpretation that would make it true and correct according to what I understood as morality. So that's what
totally.
I did. So a
Yeah,
lot of Christians accuse gay Christians of doing that because a lot of gay Christians do that. So
yeah, totally.
now that may or may not apply to you, and I'll let you finish your story now.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's a fair point. I think I'll start off by saying I don't think the Bible is true. I wouldn't hold it in the same way a lot of conservative Christians do. I don't think it's a divine book that's dropped out of heaven to give us instructions about life. I think it's a thoroughly human product. And it's from that lens, studying the Bible. I spent $100,000 getting degrees in studying Greek and Hebrew and traveling to the biblical lands and doing all this biblical study to come to the realization that frankly, these 6 passages that have been interpreted to condemn homosexuality, if you do just a cursory historical glance at how those passages came to be interpreted, you find out that the word homosexuality doesn't appear in the Bible until 1946. You find out that the word arsenokoitai, which is a Greek word that the Apostle Paul uses and is translated as homosexuality in First Corinthians and in First Timothy,
I think it's only used twice in the entire Bible, isn't it?
yeah, and
Yeah.
never used in the Greek language until Paul uses it in this
He made
context.
up a word essentially.
Yeah,
Right. Okay.
exactly. And so what there were 30 Greek words or so. I have a book where I list out all of the Greek words. There were 30 or so Greek words that one knew for homosexuality or gay sex or lesbian sex, various sexual expressions. None of them are this word that Paul uses. And so there's a question that needs to be raised, just whether you're conservative or liberal looking at this text is if Paul is trying to talk about homosexual sex, why isn't he using the word that everybody would have read and understood? Instead, he makes up a word that none of his readers would know anything about, know what the context was, unless he explained it or unless it was referring to a very specific thing that was happening in their context. And the word arsenokoitai comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 18. It's the Greek transliteration of Leviticus 18:22, which says, "A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, for this is an abomination," which is the other big clobber passage. And so essentially, historically, you have to ask, whatever Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians is clearly not homosexual sex, because he would have used another word for it, but it is referring to whatever Leviticus 18 is referring to. And so you go to Leviticus chapter 18, and if you read the entire chapter, you see very clearly the verse right before verse 22, 21 says, "Do not sacrifice your child to Molech." So the whole context of Leviticus chapter 18 is calling the Jewish people away from the pagan practices of the Egyptians. It's a religious distinction that's being made. It's don't be like the pagans. And it lists all these things the pagans are doing. And so whatever these men having sex in Leviticus 18 is referring to, it's in the context of pagan religious practice, which, to summarize really quickly, just gets us to temple prostitution, which is an ancient practice that was practiced all throughout the Greco-Roman world, but also in the ancient Near East, where gods and goddesses of sex, like Aphrodites, would have temple prostitutes, and people would go have sex with these prostitutes as an offering to the god or goddess. And Paul is condemning this religious behavior. It's not even about sexuality, it's about primarily worshiping a false deity. And that mistranslation, since 1946, has perpetuated in the English-speaking church massive amounts of homophobia. And we've exported that homophobia to places all around the world based on faulty translations. And the last thing I'll say is the proof is in the pudding on this one. In the most accurate the most accurate translation of the Bible, generally agreed, is the New Revised Standard Version. And this summer, the New Revised Standard Version, they're releasing a new edition, and it removes the word homosexuality from the text once and for all. This isn't a liberal translation. This is all the major religious Christian traditions coming together to make the translation. And so this is Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, and everyone has agreed that this word needs to be removed from the Bible because it's an inaccurate rendering of the text. And so I think this is a really good indication that the scholarship says homosexuality is not what's being referred to in these 6 passages.
Wow, there's so much you've said there that I want to go off on different directions. It's hard for me to know where to start. You mentioned a year there. I think it was 1946.
Yep.
What was the significance of 1946?
Yeah, 1946.
Because the King James Bible was 1611, I believe, right?
Yeah. So King James Version comes out in 1611. The word used in a couple of the passages is sodomy. But even that is not homosexuality. That's referring.
I agree.
Yeah. And so
actually, I should be clear. I've agreed with you on everything that I'm not acknowledging every time I agree with you. I'm familiar with these arguments because I made a lot of them back in the day. And it's also indicative of the fact that this is a well-known thing. Everything that you said is not some new information coming to light. This information is old, and these arguments have been old and rejected still by conservative Christians and Catholicism, which we'll get to in a moment. But I'm curious about why you think the homophobia escalated in 1946.
So this is probably the only new information that I'll share tonight, and it is new in the sense that some scholars in the past 5 years or so have uncovered literally a plot by the Revised Standard Version Translation Committee, which was the precursor to this translation I called the most accurate translation, the New Revised Standard Version. But the RSV was like this major translation that was coming out in the 1940s. It was the best, based on the best text that we had at that era. And the translation committee, we found letters from them, essentially, where they make a deliberate choice to put the word homosexual in as arsenokoitai. And despite all of their scholarly consensus saying that is not a correct translation, based on some homophobic experiences that these translators had, they literally said, we're going to make this homosexuality. And there's this documentary coming out in I think 6 months or so, and a book with it called 1946. Folks can Google it. It's going to
I'll
make
be looking
waves.
at it for sure.
Yeah, it's going to make waves in the Christian world because it's been meticulously researched, and they're basically proving that there was quite literally a homophobic agenda behind the word homosexuality appearing in the text. And it's why, partially, the new Revised Standards Committee is removing it, because now there's just concrete evidence that it wasn't a scholarly decision. It wasn't even a good religious decision. It was based on homophobic desires.
So, do you think that this new revised edition, when it comes out, that is going to change the tempo and the tone and the message of the churches
Not
in
at all.
any noticeable way? Because
No.
you mentioned that the Catholic Church was in some way sponsoring this,
Yeah.
but do you think that the Pope is suddenly going to say that homosexuality is not a sin anymore once this comes out?
No.
Okay.
Absolutely not, because even though we can prove that this particular translation of the Bible has homophobic backing, the fact is, and we all know this, the religious right, the movement of conservative Christianity, has made this such an orthodox issue, and they've baked it so far into the core of what their faith is that you cannot remove this sexual ethic that opposes LGBT people and the sexual ethic that opposes women's rights and abortion and all these other things. These are the core of what it means to be a conservative Christian, and it's a core of what it means to be a conservative Catholic. And they're not going to wiggle on this. They're just going to say that this is liberal propaganda. They're just going to say that this is the LGBT people influencing biblical scholarship in our modern world, and they're going to hunker down on their homophobic beliefs.
You said that you didn't believe that the Bible was true in terms of it being the actual word of God. Do you think parts of it were divinely inspired at all? Or do you think that the entire thing is just a man-made kind of set of ideas by different people who had contradictory ideas about God? Like,
Yeah.
how useful is the Bible, I guess, is what I'm asking.
So I'd say the Bible is very useful, but religious people have done weird things with these words, right? So inspiration, when we say it in just common parlance, it means one thing. But when Christians say inspiration, it's a whole theological system.
I think
So
I had my Christian hat on when I used the word, and I
Right,
assumed
yeah.
it to be that the authors were speaking to God, or that God was speaking to them, or the Holy Spirit was speaking to them and dictating what they would write. So
Right. What I would
that's
say is, no, that's not true. That didn't happen. What I would say is that the Bible is inspired by God in the same way that I believe you and I and anyone can be inspired by God. So I do believe in God. I believe God can speak through even flawed and broken texts and flawed and broken people. And I mean, there's just, if we're looking at experiential anecdotal evidence, people have had positive experiences in their life through reading the Bible. They say they've encountered God and have been transformed. So I don't want to deny that. I think the Bible, I've seen that happen in my own life. But as far as an objective standard for truth, one, we can't speak about the Bible. The Bible doesn't exist. The Bible's a concept. We're talking about a library of books. And so we can break down the 66 books of the Protestant Bible, and I would say some
I
of
like
those
it.
books
That's one of the
contain.
best statements. That is one of the best statements that anyone has ever said on my show. And it's coming from a self-identified Christian, which I find to be ironic. The
Yeah.
Bible is not really a thing. It's just an abstract collection of ideas. And yeah, so I just wanted to give you a little
Yeah.
kudos for
Thank
being
you.
the first person to actually. I've had atheists who are like Jesus mythicists and all sorts of other people come on and say, what the Bible actually is, but they've never like boiled it down succinctly into that phraseology before. So
Yeah.
kudos to that.
Well, thank you. I think it's important because conservative Christians, they talk about the Bible, and again, it's not a thing. So even my statement, like, it's an inaccurate statement for me to say the Bible isn't true or the Bible is true. There are books of the Bible that contain historical truth. There are books of the Bible that I believe contain deep spiritual wisdom. There are books of the Bible that contain really unethical, terrible things. And so whenever we're looking at any one of the books of the Bible, we have to ask, what genre is this? Who wrote this book? Is this a Jewish text? Is this an early Christian text? Is this predate Judaism, like the book of Job does? you have to ask all these questions about each individual text. And I would say I'm a biblical theologian because I find that when I study this ancient text, there is profound depth and wisdom and insight. And just from like a scholarly theological nerd perspective, like there's some really incredible, interesting things about the way human consciousness developed, how religious folks 4,000 years ago held beliefs that we still hold today. And like it gives insight into why humans think the way we think about certain things. And I do think the Bible, at its best, sometimes called humanity forward ethically. And so, looking at the ethics of Jesus in his day, he wasn't unique per se, but he was one Jewish teacher in the first century that said some pretty radical ethical things that were calling his society and his people towards a more just and equal way of being. And so, that's
So
interesting.
I should ask you, since you talked about biblical literalism and how you don't really ascribe to that, and
Yeah.
you kind of you see it for, depends on what book you go to and who wrote it and all of that. When we start looking at the Gospels, where we start getting the story of Jesus, how much of the gospel, we'll start with the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. How much of that is true? And I mean, how much of that do you accept as being an authentic telling of history?
Yeah. So again, like even that's an interesting question because we have to ask what is a gospel. The Gospels are a very unique kind of literature, but it's not unique to the Bible. These kinds of literature existed in the ancient Greco-Roman world, and so I ascribe to the Jesus Seminar, which is this group of scholars that have been working for the past 30 years or so to answer that question, to do the research to find what are the authentic sayings of Jesus based on other outside texts we have, based on what we know about first century Judaism, based on what we know about the early church. We can kind of deduce which sayings of Jesus were probably historical and which sayings are probably theological innovations by early Christians. And so it's hard to get down into exact percentages, but the Jesus Seminar has basically combed through, and there are books and books written about this that kind of condense the authentic teachings of Jesus versus the early innovations. To simplify it, what I would say is the Gospel of Mark, most of what we have in the Gospel of Mark as quotes from Jesus, most biblical scholars, even non-religious, would say these are probably accurate teachings of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. Now,
Except
Mark,
the end, because
yeah,
the Mark has like 2 or 3 different endings, I believe.
yeah. Well, the authentic ending of Mark, generally accepted, and in most Bibles, is there is no resurrection account. It's the death of Jesus, and they wake up on Sunday morning, and we're told that something happens at the tomb, but it ends there. And I think that's profound, and I think this. Some of your folks might know this, you might know this, but when I found this out about 2 years ago, it blew my mind. Um, there's a good number of scholars who have studied the Gospel of Mark and purport that Mark used Homer's Odyssey as the narrative structure for his gospel, and he inserts Jesus and Jesus's life and teachings, and he creates events in Jesus's life to follow this kind of Greco-Roman hero myth. And you can actually, there are parallels. There's a book called Demythologizing Jesus that shows the parallels of the Odyssey and some other early texts and the Gospel of Mark. And you see that this seems to me to be what the gospel writer was doing, turning Jesus into a Greek hero god. And that to me is super profound. That is probably what happened. A historical figure named Jesus existed who taught some folks some really profound things, and they honored him so much that they wanted to create him to be on the same level as Homer's gods and goddesses that he's writing about. And so, like, to me, that blows my mind. That's interesting. That makes me want to read more deeply and to know more about this historical figure. Obviously, for a conservative Orthodox Christian, that sounds like heresy, and that is going to shake up their faith. But that's exactly what we would expect folks to do in the Greco-Roman world. If there was this revolutionary teacher that appeared on the scene, they would mythologize him. And I think that's what we see in the later gospel accounts, especially in the Gospel of John. We have Jesus saying and doing things that don't appear in any of the synoptic gospels.
Yeah, I didn't ask. The reason I didn't ask about John is because I figured that would be the one that you would be least likely to support based on
Yeah,
what you've said leading up to that. So
totally.
I do have like one or two more Bible questions, but before we get to those, we have people like greeting us in the chat. So I guess I would be remiss if I didn't, greet them as well.
Well, hello.
The first person who showed up is actually a fan of yours. I think we highlighted this before the show, but you've got some TikTok followers here. We've got Jenna in the background as well. She's listening on her device in her car. So hello, Jenna. Thank you for tuning in. Bible Burner, Aaron Colson, Aunt Kathy, Gnostic Informant, some of the usual suspects, Cray Cray, Scott Jokes. She's great though. We've got Theoretically tuning in. Advice Wanted. Cool. That's a new one. Welcome Advice, and we're happy to give it. KCA Randy, we already kind of highlighted. He's a usual suspect. And James Apperson. Who else? B No Just B. What's up? We've got a lot of LGBT representation in the chat as well. Some of these names that I recognize. John Christians, Shane Billowitz. And did I miss anybody? AA, presumably. Wants you to get more into something, and I missed this comment when it first came up, so hopefully she can put it back in there, and then maybe we can elaborate. But hello, Delawarean as well. I'm also originally from Delaware, so good to see you. Cool. Well, I'm glad that people are having a good time in the chat. I had a couple of more Bible questions, and then we're going to move away from that. I wanted to read a particular Bible verse for you that is purportedly the words of Jesus, and I'm curious to get your interpretation of this. Yeah, I'm curious to get your interpretation. So it's Matthew 10 verses 37 through 39. Anyone who loves their father more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Do you think Jesus actually said that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that that is a good thing that he said?
I think when you take into the context of who Jesus was historically, I think it makes sense. Jesus, first and foremost and primarily, was a religio-political leader. He wasn't primarily coming to teach spirituality. He was coming to set his people free from the oppression of the Roman Empire.
I suppose I should have started at verse 34, where he specifically says, do not suppose that I've come to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword.
Yeah.
But, okay, so, go on.
Exactly. That's the kind of language you would expect to hear from a group of oppressed people who are seeking to start a movement that overturns their oppressor. And that's what I believe historically, reading the gospel accounts, that's what Jesus is doing.
So the correct interpretation here is to conceptualize it or contextualize it as a revolutionary who is calling the people in his community and around him a bunch of evil heretics who are trying to destroy the place, and only people who follow him will be saving it, him and his accurate teachings. Is that that's as generous of an interpretation as I can think of, but is that basically what you're...
Well, he's not talking about religious things at all. I think what he's talking, take up your crosses. I mean, that's become theologized, but it wasn't. That's saying, take up the execution chair. Be willing to go through capital punishment if you're going to follow my path, which is what happens in the Roman Empire if you try to overturn Caesar. That's why Jesus is crucified. That's why many of the other apostles are crucified. The only reason that Rome crucified people was if you were a political dissident. And so anytime Jesus is speaking about the cross, he's clearly talking about a political revolution. And what he's saying is, unless you're willing to turn away from the people and that are participating in structures of oppression, participating in the empire, and follow in my path, which may very well lead to you getting crucified alongside me, we're never going to see the revolution. We're never going to see our people freed. We're never going to see God's kingdom come. And God's kingdom was just the Jewish concept of the world being set right, their oppressor being overturned, them being set free as a people. And so you see that same language in so many other oppressed communities. I mean, you can even go back to civil rights movement and look at some of the language of folks like Malcolm X, they're calling for this radical revolution to stand up, to turn away from the folks that are perpetuating the injustice, and to overturn this thing no matter what it costs. And I think that's the lens to understand Jesus. I think you see this in Riza Aslan's book Zealot, for instance, a very good insight into the revolutionary nature of who Jesus is.
So AA was able to elaborate. She wanted to know which parts of the Bible have had such a profound impact on you and humanity. So,
Yeah.
if you can think
I
of
mean,
anything.
yeah, I mean, it's a hard question because, like the humanity side of it, different parts of it have really profound meanings for different people. And so when you're looking at the Hebrew Bible from the Jewish perspective, and you take into the context that the Jewish people have continually faced oppression for thousands of years, if you have that context as you're going and reading some of these texts where they're imagining God coming in anger to destroy their enemies, I don't support that. Like I buy into Jesus's love your neighbor stuff, but I would imagine an oppressed people would long for a God to come and save them from their enemies. That's precisely what you'd expect to find. And so, like, it helps get into the mindset of human suffering. For me, I do find Jesus, especially like during the Trump era, I found reading Jesus was actually really profound and
What?
encouraging.
Trump's not the second coming of Christ, isn't
No,
he? MAGA tells me that he is sent by God, and all authorities on earth are put there by God. No, they're not
Trump
right.
is quite literally the Antichrist character from the evangelical Left Behind books. It's profound to me how their misinterpretation of those end times passages illustrated somebody like Trump, and then as soon as the Antichrist rises on the scene, they don't acknowledge him. Like they messed up their own narrative.
I would have agreed 100% with that back when I was a Christian. By the way, my interpretation is a little bit different now that I don't believe in the Antichrist.
Yeah,
However, the fact that these people do and they don't see the answer, like, I thought it was somewhat ridiculous. Even when I was a Christian, this idea this was one of the hardest things for me to believe, even when I was a believer, that
yeah,
all of these people would be that blinded by evil to just blindly follow evil. I had difficulties with stories going back to the Exodus, where they're building a golden calf to worship after being rescued by God out of the bonds of slavery.
yeah,
That's not a realistic story because people don't behave that way. And then looking forward to the future, where Revelation is talking about people following the mark of the beast and all that.
yeah.
It just didn't seem reasonable to me that people would follow someone like that until Donald Trump was elected, and you listen to all of his supporters calling him the second coming of Christ. So I guess I have to I stand corrected on that point. Maybe it is realistic. Maybe people are just that dumb.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, again, and this is why the Bible is helpful, I would contend, like the book of Revelation, another text that's very profound if it's understood in its historical context. The Antichrist in Revelation, again, most biblical scholars would say this, is the Emperor Nero. This was written by a group of Christians facing persecution from the empire in the second century ish, end of the first century. And Emperor Nero was going around and threatening Christians with prison time and or death or exile. And so they created this language to talk about him in a way that wasn't going to get them killed. And so they talk about him. 666 is literally, I'm going to mess up with what it's called, but it's numbers that represent letters, and the letters spell out the title of Emperor Nero. This isn't some crazy numerology thing. Again, this is like historically attested outside of biblical sources. And so the book of Revelation is people, these Christians, writing about this evil emperor that they actually knew and that existed in their day. And they're essentially calling on God or dreaming of the day that Jesus will come back and kill this Antichrist and set them free. And so, like, Revelation is a historical text. It was talking about a historical reality, and that historical reality repeats itself throughout history. And Donald Trump era was one of those moments where it was like, here are groups of oppressed people looking at this man who is perpetuating injustice to them. And in the same way that the religious folks all bowed the knee to Donald Trump, um, it was actually the faithful non-believers and the faithful progressives and everything else that were able to identify him as the Antichrist and refuse to take the mark of the beast, so to speak. Anyways, I could
Okay.
rant on that for hours.
So, and my answer to the question AA is I do also agree that there are useful things in the Bible that can inspire people towards positivity. that Jesus said, and the one that comes, and I'm saying this as an atheist, of course, but the one that comes to mind is, let he who is without sin be the first to cast a stone at the so-called adulterers. I don't believe that that's a true story, but I do believe it is. It's akin to the boy who cried wolf. It doesn't have to be a true story in order for there to be a moral lesson there. And there was hypocrisy and a bunch of sinners telling someone else that they deserve to be stoned for their sin. It just doesn't make sense. Jesus or whoever wrote that, I'm glad that's in the Bible, because you can use that, even as an atheist, you can use that against Christians who are intent on doing that. They're the first people to call people like Brandan heretic and a blasphemer and a sinner, and I'm sure you've been called worse things as well, but we don't have to get too deeply into that. So yes, I would acknowledge that there are some good things, some good teachings in the Bible, some useful teachings. There's also some harmful ones, in my opinion. And just the last kind of God related question, or the last Jesus related question: do you think Jesus was actually the Son of God?
Yes, but not theologically. Son of God was a political title, and Caesar was called the Son of God. And so I think
Well, a lot
Jesus
of
is
people were called the Son of God. And so
right.
maybe I guess if I asked the question from a fundamentalist Christian, would probably say he was the only begotten Son. That implies some sort of oneness with God. And he
Yeah.
says, I and the Father are one, implying the Trinity.
John
So
says that.
do you think that he has a godly, do you think he's basically God in the flesh? As the
I do think
Catholic Church
I
would
would
say, fully God and fully man.
I would affirm Jesus is God in the flesh, and I would affirm that God is in the flesh of all things. And so I'm not Orthodox Christian. I don't affirm the Orthodox Christian belief in the incarnation per se, but I would say that I think God was in Jesus as much as God is in you and me and all things and all people. And I think the Christian tradition historically has also held a view called theosis, which is that humanity is moving towards union and oneness with God in the same way that Jesus was one with God. And so,
Well, it
do I
actually
think?
says that in the Bible too.
Yeah, exactly.
They ignore that part. I'm talking about all of the Trinitarians, which is the majority of Christianity. Everyone can quickly point to the Father and I are one, but
Yeah,
no one points to the verse that says, "And all of the followers are one, just like we are one."
yeah,
I can't remember which verse that is, but it's definitely in there.
yeah. Jesus
Um,
says that,
so that's interesting. So he was no more supernatural than you or I, per se.
and he said that. He said, "All the things I have done, you can do, and more." That's one of the last things he says to his disciples. So, like, this is all in his teaching. Jesus always is deflecting worship in the Synoptic Gospels. He's not claiming to be the only incarnation of God. That would have been blasphemy for him as a Jewish man. So, there's no Jewish concept in which Jesus would have claimed to be God, and it's just absurd to think that he would have done so. He could have said, "I am one with God, but
Mhm.
also you and I are one with God." So
So thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about other faiths for a moment. We kind of skirted around it. We've talked to death about Christianity, but what is your view on Islam, on the Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, Hinduism, Baha'i, anything like, how do these other religions compare to your beliefs? And do you think that these are harmful practices, beneficial practices? Do they comport with your beliefs?
yeah.
What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think religion is just a reality. Religion is something that emerges in all cultures throughout all of history. It's a way for humans to make sense of the world and the universe and their place in it. It's also a way for them to express their culture and their myths and their stories. And every culture has those things. And even in our modern era, even as we're becoming more secular, there are, um, I would argue, secular traditions and secular myths that are
That was
emerging.
intentional, by the way, but thank
Yeah,
you.
but so yeah, I think all these religions are neutral in the fact that they exist. Religion emerges to help folks make sense of the world. I think every one of these religions also has a fundamentalist strand, which usually looks nothing like what the founders of these religions started with, but as time evolves, humans tend to get caught up in power and privilege. And one way they create systems of power and domination is through creating belief structures and hierarchies. And that's when you get into these corrupt abuses of religion. But I think the idea of religion as a way for people to express culture and myth and to have a common language to talk about their experiences in the world, I think is a great thing. And I think all of these paths, in the same way that we would respect cultures in general that are different than our culture, I would say religion is quite similar. When
You
we're
took
talking,
sociology in college, didn't you?
no, I went to Moody Bible Institute. We didn't learn such things. So
Well, the reason I assumed
yeah,
that, I know you
yeah,
went
yeah,
to a Bible school, but I assumed you had supplemented your education elsewhere, because the
yeah,
things that you're talking to me about are things that wouldn't be taught specifically at
totally,
Bible school. In fact, it's antithetical to a lot of what they do teach. So
yeah,
I'm just wondering how you came to that realization. A lot of what you said is true according to what's taught in
yeah,
sociology, but how did
yeah.
you discover this if not in school? And
Well, not to sound overly arrogant, but I think some of this stuff is just really it's basic observation for a majority of people. It's like only if you've been indoctrinated are you going to believe that there's only one right religion and that all other religions are evil and wrong. Like that's you have to be taught that. But if you're just a normal human being that's functioning in the world, not in a hyper religious environment, I think you might come to a position like I'm sure many on this on watching right now have a position that religion in general is probably bad. Fine. But I think we can all acknowledge that the fact that religion exists is a neutral reality. It just emerges. I mean, in the earliest days of human consciousness, there were religious impulses among the earliest human beings. And so um, I'm the reason I'm still interested in religion, not just Christianity, is because I'm interested in trying to answer the big questions of life and trying to find meaning in my own life and help others to find meaning. And for me, the religious systems and the traditions um, have wisdom that I can learn from and move on from and discard when it's no longer useful. But I find studying religion and interacting with religion a helpful way to help me think through meaning in life. And then the last thing I'll say is, despite some of the hopes of atheists, religion's not going anywhere anytime in the future. And so my interest as a progressive agnostic Christian is to figure out, are there ways we can advocate for healthier expressions of religion? If Christianity is going to still exist, we need to find ways to reduce the harm that Christianity or institutions of Christian religion is doing in the world and maximize the potential for goodness in these organized religions.
do you think that there is an objective meaning and purpose for life, or just subjective meanings and purposes?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think,
Because you spoke a moment ago, you spoke about your one of your goals is to help people find meaning and purpose. And oftentimes, when I discuss this with religious people, they will say that the coming from a Christian background anyway, they will say that the meaning and purpose is objective and established by God.
yeah,
And this is obviously something atheists reject because we don't believe in a God.
yeah,
And it's something that different religions would come to different conclusions about what that meaning is, since they have books that supposedly say
yeah,
what their version of God says the meaning is, right?
totally.
So what is your interpret when you're looking to help people find meaning and purpose? Is the meaning and purpose the same for everyone, or is it different for everyone but all prescribed by something other than themselves, or do they apply meaning to their own lives?
Yeah. Well, I think folks can see behind me. Maybe I have a picture of the myth of Sisyphus hanging on my wall and a quote from Albert Camus. So and that kind of structures the way I think about the purpose and meaning of life. I think humans create our own meaning, and I think we have to find our meaning, make meaning. However, I'm still, and this might just be a theistic belief hangover, but I probably believe that there is an objective meaning, but I don't think we have the ability as subjective human beings to ever access that. And so I believe that there's a grand purpose for everything that's happening in the universe. The fact that we exist, I think there's a reason for that. I don't think we have any hope of ever knowing what that reason is. And so with that being the reality, we're called to create the meaning of our lives. We're called to, like Sisyphus, roll the stone up the hill and find ways to be happy in this absurd reality that we exist in. And so that's the tension I probably live within.
This seems like such a simplistic question comparative to everything we've discussed so far, but actually it may be the most important question that hasn't been asked. So we've talked a lot about God, but we haven't spent any time talking about what God is or what you think God is. Usually when I ask theists this question, we end up in some sort of cosmological argument where God is defined with a bunch of negative attributes. He's timeless, spaceless, materialless, uncaused. And they spend a lot of time telling me what God is not, but no time telling me what God actually is. So, what is God to you?
Yeah. The language I use to talk about God is it's biblical language, funny enough, but I would say God is the ground of being. The Apostle Paul quotes a pagan in Acts chapter 8, I think. I might be wrong there. But he quotes a pagan poet who says, "In God we live and move and have our being." So when I talk about God, I'm talking about reality itself. I'm talking about life itself, being itself, consciousness itself. And I don't think God is a personal being per se. I think God clearly manifests sometimes personally. In my worldview, I do think God shows up in our lives and can show up in our world. But essentially, I would ascribe to a theology that would say the moment we start using language to describe God, we're failing in our explanation because words cannot contain the infinite reality that we're trying to speak of. And so
it sounds close to pantheism to some extent.
Totally.
Okay. Interesting. That's fine. But this of course does put a little bit of light on another reason why so many who identify as Christian would reject your theology, because most Christians would identify as theists, as monotheists, even though they're not. They're polytheists in reality. Christianity is a polytheistic religion, in case you guys didn't know. But they claim to be monotheistic, and so when you suggest anything close to pantheism, they're like, well, that can't be Christianity. So that wasn't really a question. That was just kind of a statement of gee whiz. I can't remember if I asked you this the last time I talked to you. Have you ever heard Katharine Hepburn's quote on Jesus? She's a famous actress back in the 40s, 50s, like the golden era of Hollywood, and she had a really distinctive voice. But she was an atheist. She was a very prominent out atheist, which was very rare and unusual for that time. And she had done talk shows where she talks about not believing in, religion, not really believing in an afterlife, or, thinking that morality was kind of self-evident. But she did say that she believed in Christ, and her description of that was she believes in the idea or the message behind someone who would be willing to sacrifice for their fellow man. And that's an ideal that everyone should live up to and aspire towards, which would make everyone's life great, And so in a sense, she was an atheist Christian. And if she was an atheist Christian, I guess someone could be a pantheist Christian. It all comes down to how we're defining Christianity.
Totally.
Which doesn't really have an objective meaning, does it?
Exactly. And that's why I still use the word Christian. Part of it is legitimately to kind of piss off those who claim exclusive rights to the word Christian. Christianity, there's never been a thing called Christianity. This is another thing modern religious scholars have all admitted, that there's always been Christianities from the very earliest days of the Jesus movement. The individual groups that were forming in people's homes had very different beliefs and practices, and we've always known that. And so this whole idea of this unified Orthodox Christian theology for 2,000 years.
I'm getting flamed from people in the audience who I think are a little bit older than me and, wondering why I'm explaining it to. But this is but just context. He's under 30 years old. A lot of his TikTok followers are under 30 years old. They might not know Katharine Hepburn. So
I appreciate it
for them. And I think even the people who do know her may not know that particular fact about her. But who knows? Maybe they do. So sorry, I interrupted your train of thought there.
No, it's
I
all
thought that
good.
was funny. Okay, so we talked about meaning in life. Your answer to the previous question makes the next question that I was going to ask rather moot. I was going to ask, are there many paths to God or just one? But you've already kind of answered that indirectly. So let's talk about your activism and what you're up to now. The last time we talked, you were being kind of shuffled out of the more conservative, you know, you blasphemous heretic, that's not Christianity, we don't want you anymore, and you were in between ministries. What have you been
Yeah.
doing since then?
Yeah. So, I mean,
And have you found a new congregation?
so in January, essentially what we've done, we took this audience that has grown on TikTok. I was doing these like Bible studies on Tuesday nights, and we had like over the last year, 800 people or so signed up to be a part of these various Zoom Bible studies. And basically that was a moment of realization for me was I don't need a brick and mortar community. I don't need to be in a traditional church. We have Zoom. We have these people that are willing to want to engage and talk about Christianity in new ways. And so in January, we launched Metanoia, which is
So I did say it correctly. I
you
think that's what I
did.
said in the beginning. I
You
was a little
did.
uncertain, but okay.
Yeah, it's a Greek word that actually in the Bible is translated as repent, funny enough. But if you take the etymology of the word, meta is to expand, noia, your mind. It literally means to expand your mind. Um,
Mhm.
and so our community, we meet 2 Sundays a month on Zoom, and we go to a biblical passage and basically have a discussion. It's not a didactic me telling what the perspective should be, but it's like, let's wrestle with this text, let's disagree with this text. And it usually gets us into important conversations around justice and politics and the meaning of life and all of these things. And so that's what I'm doing as far as church and ministry right now. And it's been really incredible to be able to, in the same way you're doing right here, bring people together from around the world to have unique conversations. And I think this is, in some sense, one of the futures of religious conversation or spirituality is going to be the ability to dialogue all around the world with different perspectives at the same time. And my hope is that this community that we are cultivating continues to help heal people from religious trauma and provoke people to think in new ways that are less destructive in the world when it comes to religious faith.
I think our goals are probably very similar. I think that the language that we would use to describe our goals is probably different because I wouldn't
Sure.
describe this as religious or spiritual. I would describe it as community, and
Yeah.
I think fellowship is kind of a neutral word, but I know what you mean when you say that, and I think that's some of the kind of the religious theistic baggage. So, not trying to use a
Yeah.
negative word, but
Yeah.
I view it as religious baggage
Yeah.
carried into a common goal. So I don't beat anyone up too much for it because the goal is an admirable one. I think maybe the differences between us are really mostly language. And, there is the fundamental issue of you believing that God exists, although from the way that you described God, I might not be too far away from you now than I thought I was at the beginning of the show.
Yeah.
I thought you might define God differently. But so I guess my last question is, where do you see yourself and the movement, so to speak, in 5 years? And do you think that Christianity as a whole will move more in a liberal direction, more in a conservative direction, or kind of just will it always be just these two diverse camps?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I think there are some really significant movements in global Christianity for progress. I know this isn't meant to sound like ridiculous name dropping, but I know folks that are working like in the Vatican very closely with Pope Francis that are actually indicating progress on some of these big issues like LGBT inclusion, and so getting to watch that happen in real time. I don't think the Catholic Church is all of a sudden going to become an LGBT inclusive institution in the next 50 years, but I do know that we are in this moment where these institutions are being challenged from within. And I think that is going to impact some of the direction of Christianity. I think in the United States, Christianity is going to continue to have to contend with this movement of deconstruction folks and ex-evangelicals, folks like me and many who have left religion altogether, but are still wanting to engage in conversations around Christianity, which is TikTok is a great arena where that's happening. I think that's going to continue to shape and challenge the way Christianity looks in the world. But again, on one sense, the worst kind of Christianity, religious far-right Christianity, it's not going to go anywhere. And I think we have another election cycle coming up, and we're going to see a resurgence of Donald Trump be in Christianity and politics. And that's why I am so committed to my work as a progressive Christian. And I think why there needs to be alliances between atheists and agnostics and humanists and progressive people of faith, because really what we're doing as progressive Christians is trying to push the institutions from the inside. I think the work that atheists and humanists are doing from the outside to critique and challenge the religious institutions are important. And I think in a moment where we might face another horrendous religious resurgence of homophobia and racism and hatred in the near future, we need all of these forces working together to deconstruct the bad that religion is doing and advocate for a better, more just and equal way to be in the world. And so that's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, and I highlighted this question because it kind of intersects with something else you mentioned a little while ago with the Catholic Church. You said that you didn't think that the church would suddenly reverse their stance on homosexuality and all of that. However, and what Aunt Jer is saying here about the Catholic Church, totally understandable given their history. However, I will say this. I think that the Catholic Church will be the first and most influential church to actually do that, because one advantage that the Catholic Church has over some of the other Christian denominations is their ability and willingness to change. They don't hold to sola scriptura doctrine. For them, divine revelation is this kind of continuous thing. With the new pope comes maybe a new revelation. They can just reverse things at the drop of a dime, you know.
Yeah.
And now that you have a new this new revised what is it, revised standard edition, is that what it's called?
Yep.
Or
New revised standard version.
New revised standard version coming out 10, 15, 20 years from now, we don't know who the next pope is going to be, but they may be one who's read that Bible, you know, in Latin or whatever for translation. And maybe they are inspired to say, hey, this is not anti-gay at all. Why are we still anti-gay? For the new decree from divine inspiration, it's okay to love gays. You know, I think they will probably be the first church to do that. It's certainly not going to be coming from the fundamentalist Protestant right in the United States. I think we can all agree to that, because they're so beholden to the tradition and that doctrine of sola scriptura that they can never change. That religion just has to die, or at least be so minimized that it can have little impact anymore. Whereas the Catholic Church, being this worldwide influential organization, can actually cause change. But that's about all the time we have. But I do want to give you the opportunity to promote anything you have upcoming, talk about what you're going to be doing in the future, maybe on TikTok, or have the final word in the conversation.
Totally. Well, I'm grateful for this space and to be invited into these spaces to have these kind of conversations. I think, I encourage folks to come on over onto TikTok and engage in the conversations that we're having there. That's why we do it. And what's really inspires me about the TikTok work is there are so many young people that need to be exposed either to progressive faith or atheism and healthy ways to move forward beyond toxic religion. And having these communities where I formed so many alliances on TikTok with atheists and agnostics and humanists. And I think there's synergy here. I see some of the comments that are talking about like this mutuality, us working together as we seek to detoxify the bad side of religion in the world. Come and join in that work over on TikTok. But yeah.
Well, that's exactly why I do what I do as a secular humanist who likes to promote positive atheism, secular humanism, and also kind of the bridging of the gulf between, religion and theism to work together for the common goals of humanity. So with that said, if any of you in the audience are interested, are more interested in, learning about the Reverend Brandan Robertson here, we have links to his TikTok as well as his Facebook, or not Facebook, but what is it, TikTok, YouTube channel, sorry, because you still have an active YouTube channel.
Yep.
And also your website is in the description and a link below too. So check that out. And as always, guys, if you've liked this show, hit the like button and subscribe to Tang if you haven't already. All of you should be subscribed right now. I can't imagine a situation in which one of you isn't, but who knows? We get the occasional new person. If you like the conversation, we do this quite often. So definitely subscribe. Brandan, it's been a pleasure. Do me a favor and stick around a little bit after the closing of the show. I have a couple more things to say to you. But guys, I am here Tuesdays, 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And for producer Oz, producer Wes, and Sunny Shell, my name is Bryce Aroni. Have a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good night. I will see you next time on The Bryce is Right.